The air at the Henderson County Equipment Auction hung thick and heavy, a humid August soup of diesel fumes, sweat, and the sweet, cloying smell of popcorn from a stand near the gate. It was 1973, and the mood was electric. Grain prices were sky-high, farmers felt like kings, and the auctioneer's chant was the anthem of a new golden age. Tractors, big green and shiny red ones with enclosed cabs and radios, were going for prices that would have bought a whole farm just 10 years prior. Frank Miller stood near the back, his arms crossed over his chest, a sweat-stained seed corn cap pulled low over his brow. He wasn't here for the new iron. His eyes were fixed on a tired, faded machine parked off to the side, away from the main attractions. It was a Farmall M, a 1948 by the look of the serial tag, its red paint bleached to a dull orange by 30 Illinois summers. The tires were cracked, a greasy film coated the engine block, and a rusty tin can was flopped over the exhaust pipe. To most of the men here, it was a ghost, a relic from their father's time. To Frank, it was an opportunity. "All right, folks, let's move along." The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim Perkins, bellowed from his portable stand. "We got a real piece of history here. A Farmall M. Runs, I'm told. A classic. Who'll start the bidding for me at $500? $500? Can I get $500? A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. $500 wouldn't even cover the down payment on a new set of tires for the John Deere 40 or 430 that had just sold for a staggering $18,000. From the corner of his eye, Frank saw Warren Bishop nudge the man next to him, a slick-looking salesman from the local John Deere dealership. Warren was everything Frank wasn't. His farm, just 3 miles down the road from Frank's place, was a showcase of modern agriculture. He'd been one of the first in the county to buy a 6-row corn planter, and his new 4430, with its sound guard cab and air conditioning, was the envy of every farmer under 50. He farmed more land, drove a newer truck, and carried a debt load that made Frank's stomach clench just thinking about it. "Look at that! Miller's sniffing around the scrap heap again," Warren said, just loud enough for Frank to hear. His voice was slick with the easy confidence of a man whose operating loan had just been approved without a second glance. The Deere salesman laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Some guys just can't get with the times, Warren. Still thinks it's 1950. Probably gonna try and pay for it with cash he's got buried in a mason jar." Frank's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn around. He'd heard it all before. He'd inherited his 160 acres free and clear when his dad passed 5 years back. The old man had been a Depression-era farmer, a man who distrusted banks more than he distrusted a sudden hailstorm in July. "Don't you ever owe another man for the dirt under your feet or the tools in your hand, son," he'd told Frank 100 times. "Debt is a chain, and the banker holds the other end." It was a lesson Frank had taken to heart. His main tractor was a Farmall H, a machine his father had bought brand new in 1952. Frank knew every nut, bolt, and wire on that tractor. He'd rebuilt the engine himself, knew the precise feel of the clutch, the particular growl it made when the 2-bottom plow bit deep into the black soil. He owned it. It didn't own him. "400! Do I hear 400? Slim Perkins pleaded, his rhythm faltering. The crowd was getting restless, eager to get to the newer, bigger equipment. 200, Frank said, his voice calm and clear. It cut through the murmuring. Slim's head snapped in his direction. $200 from Frank Miller. I got 2. Who'll give $250? $250? Silence. Warren Bishop let out an exaggerated sigh. Just sell the poor man his toy, Slim. He needs something to tinker with. More laughter. Frank's face burned, but his expression remained a mask of stone. He He was used to being the subject of their jokes at the co-op and the diner. Miller, the man who was farming like his granddaddy, the man who was letting the greatest boom in agricultural history pass him by because he was too scared to take a risk. 200 going once, going twice. Slim looked around, hoping for a pity bid. None came. Sold for $200 to Frank Miller. A smattering of sarcastic applause broke out from Warren's group. Frank ignored them. He walked over to the auction clerk's table, pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, and counted out 10 crisp $20 bills. No paperwork, no loan applications, no signing his life away for the next 5 years. He was now the owner of a second tractor. He found the previous owner, an old farmer named Gus, who was selling out and moving to Florida. Gus handed him a coffee can full of spare gaskets and a greasy, dog-eared operator's manual. "She's got a sticky third gear, and the magneto can be temperamental in the damp," Gus said, his voice raspy. "But the engine's sound never let me down in 30 years. "I'll take good care of her," Frank promised, shaking the old man's calloused hand. As Frank went to fetch his truck and trailer, Warren Bishop stepped into his path. He had a smirk on his face, the look of a man who thought he had the world figured out. "Seriously, Frank? Another one of those things?" Warren gestured dismissively at the old Farmall. "My 4430 could plow your whole farm in the time it takes you to get that thing started on a cold morning." "Maybe so, Warren," Frank said, meeting his gaze. "But when you're sitting in that air-conditioned cab, are you listening to the radio, or are you listening to your engine? Can you tell by the sound if a bearing is starting to go? Can you feel a change in the hydraulic pressure through the seat of your pants?" Warren just scoffed. "I don't need to. It's brand new. I've got a warranty. The dealer handles any problems." "And the bank handles the payments," Frank added quietly. The smirk on Warren's face faltered for just a second. "You gotta spend money to make money, Frank. It's the new way. Get big or get out. You and your museum pieces are gonna get left in the dust." He clapped Frank on the shoulder, a gesture that was more condescending than friendly, and walked away, laughing with the deer salesman. Frank watched them go, then turned back to his new purchase. Left in the dust. Maybe. But he'd be standing on his own 2 feet in that dust, owing nothing to anyone. He hooked the old M up to the winch on his trailer and slowly, carefully, pulled his $200 investment home. Now, before we go any further in this story, I have to ask you all a question. Think back for a minute. What was the very first tractor you ever learned how to drive? Was it an old hand cranker like Frank's, with a stiff clutch and a seat that would rattle your teeth out? Or was it something newer, something with power steering and a key start? Let me know down in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading about the machines that shaped you all. The next few weeks for Frank were a blur of grease, sweat, and the metallic tang of rust. He backed the Farmall M into the corner of his machine shed, a space that smelled of damp earth, old oil, and the faint, sharp scent of the welding torch. His Farmall H was parked on the other side, its red paint still decent, its engine clean. The M looked like its forgotten, neglected older brother. Frank wasn't a mechanic by trade, but he'd learned more from his father and a lifetime of necessity than any school could teach. He started by draining the fluids. The engine oil came out thick and black as tar, the transmission fluid a milky, water-contaminated grey. He pulled the spark plugs. They were fouled, the gaps all wrong. This wasn't just neglect. It was a machine that had been run hard and put away wet for years. He spent a full Saturday just pressure washing the engine block, peeling away decades of caked-on grease and dirt. Underneath, the cast iron was solid. He took a wrench to the head bolts, breaking them loose with a series of sharp, grunting cracks. The head came off, heavy and awkward. He peered down into the cylinders. The walls had some light scoring, but nothing a good honing wouldn't fix. The pistons had some carbon buildup, but the sleeves looked tight. Gus was right. The engine was sound. He ordered a full engine rebuild kit from the local Napa Auto Parts store. New sleeves, pistons, rings, gaskets, the works. The kid behind the counter, barely out of high school, had to blow a layer of dust off a thick catalogue to find the part numbers. "Farmall M?" the kid had asked. "My grandpa had one of those." While he waited for the parts, Frank turned his attention to the rest of the tractor. He pulled the magneto, a heavy Wyco model, and took it apart on his workbench. He carefully cleaned the points with a fine file, checked the condenser, and retimed it. He took the carburetor apart, soaking the jets in cleaner, blowing out every passage with compressed air until it shone like new. He knew that 90% of engine problems were either fuel or fire, and he was taking no chances. Warren Bishop drove past Frank's place almost every day on his way to the new 160 acres he was farming. He'd slow his new Ford pickup down, the diesel engine rumbling, and watch Frank hunched over the disassembled tractor. Sometimes he'd honk and wave, a mocking little gesture. Frank would just lift a greasy hand in return and go back to work. The talk at the grain elevator was relentless. "Saw Frank Miller the other day," one farmer would say, leaning against a sack of feed. "Looked like he was performing surgery on that old relic he bought. More grease on him than in the tractor." "He's going to miss the fall tillage window," another would add. "While we're all out there with our big disc chisels, he'll still be trying to get that thing to fire." Frank heard the whispers. He felt the stares. He knew they saw him as a stubborn fool, a man clinging to the past, while the future was ripe for the picking. But what they saw as foolishness, Frank saw as freedom. Every bolt he tightened was a victory. Every part he cleaned and restored was a declaration of independence. He wasn't waiting on a dealer's mechanic to fit him into their schedule. He wasn't paying $100 an hour for labor. He was paying with his own time, his own sweat, and his own knowledge. The engine parts finally arrived. For 3 straight nights, after his regular chores were done, Frank worked under the bare bulb of his machine shed. He honed the cylinder walls until they had a perfect crosshatch pattern. He carefully installed the new sleeves, using a block of wood and a heavy mallet to tap them into place. He fitted the new rings onto the pistons, staggering the gaps just so, and oiled them liberally before sliding them back into their bores. He torqued the head bolts down in the proper sequence, his muscles straining against the long wrench. Finally, the day came. The engine was back together, the fluids were fresh, the fuel tank was filled with clean gasoline. He climbed onto the iron seat, the cold metal a familiar shock. He pulled the choke, cracked the throttle open just a bit, and took a deep breath. He grabbed the hand crank, fitted it onto the front of the crankshaft, and gave it a mighty heave. The engine coughed once, a puff of black smoke spitting from the open exhaust port. He gave it another pull, putting his whole body into it. It coughed again, then sputtered. On the third pull, it caught. The sputtering turned into a rough, uneven rumble, and then, as Frank adjusted the throttle and choke, it smoothed out into the deep, rhythmic, thumping heartbeat of a healthy Farmall engine. Pop, 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 pop. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. Frank let it run for a half hour, watching the temperature gauge, checking for leaks, listening to the music of the machine. There were no strange knocks, no rattles, no squeals, just the steady, reliable rhythm of American iron, brought back to life by his own 2 hands. The next day, he hooked it up to his old 3-bottom plow. The sticky third gear Gus had mentioned was still there, but Frank found he could work around it. The tractor pulled strong and true. The governor responded perfectly, the engine digging in and pulling harder as the plowshares bit deep into the soil. He plowed a 10-acre field that afternoon, the smell of freshly turned earth mixing with the scent of hot engine oil and exhaust. He was out in the open, the sun on his back, the wind in his face. He could feel the tractor through the seat, hear every nuance of the engine. He was connected to the work, to the land, in a way he knew Warren Bishop, sealed inside his climate-controlled cab, could never be. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field, he saw the telltale cloud of dust coming down the road. It was Warren, this time in his massive John Deere 4640, pulling a 7-shank V-ripper. He'd traded up again. Warren pulled over and killed the big diesel, the sudden silence almost jarring. He swung down from the cab, looking clean and fresh. Frank, covered in a fine layer of dust and a sheen of sweat, shut down the M. "Well, I'll be," Warren said, a hint of genuine surprise in his voice. "You actually got the old girl running." "She runs good," Frank said simply, wiping his forehead with the back of his glove. "Look, Frank," Warren said, his tone shifting from mockery to something like pity. "I get it. You like the old ways. But you're killing yourself. I just ripped my 80 over there in 3 hours. How long did this little patch take you?" "Most of the afternoon," Frank admitted. "See? That's what I'm talking about. Time is money. You're working 4 times as hard for the same result. The price of corn is over $3 a bushel. The Russians are buying everything we can grow. People are getting rich, Frank. This is our one big chance, and you're wasting it trying to keep these museum pieces alive." "I'm not wasting it, Warren. I'm banking it." Warren shook his head in disbelief. "Banking it? Money in the bank is losing value every day with this inflation. You got to put it to work. Buy land. Buy iron. Leverage. That's the name of the game now." "It's a game I'm not interested in playing," Frank said. "You're a fool, Miller," Warren said, his patience gone. "A stubborn, backward fool. When I own half this county, don't come asking me for a job." He climbed back into his big green tractor, sealed the door, and with a roar of its powerful turbocharged engine, he pulled back onto the road, leaving Frank and his little Farmall in a cloud of dust. Frank watched him go, the setting sun glinting off the new paint of the 4640. A fool. Maybe he was. But as he looked over the neat, straight furrows he had just turned, at the machine he had brought back from the dead, and at the farm that was his, all his, he felt a quiet sense of peace that he knew no bank loan could ever buy. The years that followed seemed to prove Warren Bishop right. The mid-1970s were a boom time, the likes of which no one had ever seen. The grain embargo was a distant memory, and American farms were feeding the world. Prices for corn and soybeans stayed high and climbed higher. Land values, which had been creeping up steadily, suddenly exploded. The 160 acres next to Frank that had sold for $600 an acre in 1970 was worth $2,000 an acre by 1976. Warren Bishop rode the wave like a champion. He was the golden boy of Henderson County agriculture. The high prices meant his loan payments were easy to make, and the soaring land values gave him massive equity on paper. He used that equity as collateral to borrow more, buying up another quarter section when old man Peterson retired. He built a brand new brick ranch house for his family, complete with a 2-car garage and central air. He traded his equipment every 2 years, always having the latest and greatest. His operation was a gleaming testament to the power of progress and aggressive financing. He was featured in a farm magazine, standing in front of his new grain bins, a confident smile on his face, hailed as a farmer of the future. Frank, meanwhile, continued on his own steady, quiet path. The boom years were good to him too. He was getting the same high prices for his grain as everyone else. The difference was, his costs were a fraction of theirs. He had no massive loan payments due every quarter. His machinery repairs were paid for with a trip to the salvage yard and a few hours of his own time, not with a four-figure bill from a dealership. His property taxes went up with the land values, and that stung. But it was a manageable sting. With the extra money, he didn't buy new tractors or more land. He reinvested in the farm he already had. He paid cash to have a tiling crew systematically pattern tile his 80 acres of bottom ground, turning a wet, unpredictable field into his most productive land. He built a new, larger machine shed, a sturdy pole barn he designed, and put up himself with the help of a few neighbors, so he could keep all his equipment out of the weather. He did buy another tractor, but it wasn't new. He found a 1965 International 706 with a German diesel engine, wide front end, and a factory cab, though the cab was nothing more than a steel and glass box that amplified the engine noise and turned into an oven in the summer. It was a big step up in power from his Farmalls, allowing him to pull a 5-bottom plough and a wider disc, but he still paid cash for it, haggling the seller down to a price that made him feel comfortable. His 2 Farmalls, the H and the M he'd resurrected, were still the heart of the operation. He used them for planting, cultivating, running the grain auger, and 100 other daily chores. They were simple, reliable, and sipped fuel compared to the big new diesels. In the eyes of the community, the gap between Frank Miller and Warren Bishop had become a chasm. Warren was a success story. Frank was an eccentric, a throwback. At the diner, the other farmers would talk about Warren's new combine, a John Deere 7700 with a hydrostatic transmission and a grain monitor. Then the conversation would turn to Frank, and they'd shake their heads. Still cultivating his corn with that old M, one would say. Could be farming 1,000 acres by now if he wasn't so scared of the bank. Frank felt their judgment, but it no longer bothered him. He was making a good living. His farm was more productive than ever. And every night he slept soundly, with a peace of mind that came from knowing that everything he had, he truly owned. He had money in a savings account at the local bank, earning a modest but steady interest. One afternoon in the late 70s, he went to the bank to make a deposit. The bank manager, a man named Mr. Abernathy, called him into his office. Abernathy was a cheerleader for the boom, his bank's fortunes tied directly to the ever-increasing debt load of the local farmers. "Frank, good to see you," Abernathy said, gesturing to a plush chair. "Look, I was just reviewing your accounts. You've got a very healthy savings built up here. Very commendable." "Thank you," Frank said. "Been a few good years." "That's just it," Abernathy said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "They're more than good years, Frank. They're the best ever. And that money you have sitting in savings, with inflation running at 7–8%, you're actually losing money every day it sits there. You need to put that capital to work." He spread a county plat map across his desk. "The old Hemmings place is coming up for sale. 200 acres, prime ground, right next to you. We could put together a loan package for you. Use your current farm as collateral. Land values are only going one way, Frank. Up. In 5 years, you'll have doubled your equity. It's a can't-miss opportunity." Frank looked at the map. He knew the land. It was good land. The temptation was there, a flicker of the same ambition that drove Warren and the others. The thought of doubling his acreage, of finally shutting up the doubters. He thought of his father. He thought of the long nights spent rebuilding the M, the satisfaction of hearing it fire up. He thought of the peace of mind he felt during a thunderstorm, knowing no banker could take his home away. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Abernathy," Frank said, standing up. "But I think I'll just stick with what I've got." Abernathy looked at him with a mixture of pity and frustration, the way a man looks at someone who just won't see reason. "You're missing the boat, son. You're missing the boat." As Frank walked out of the office, the door opened, and Warren Bishop strode in, clapping Abernathy on the back. They were laughing about something, two men who spoke the language of leverage and expansion. Frank gave a polite nod and headed for the exit. Outside, he climbed into his old Chevy pickup. He turned the key, and the radio crackled to life. A news announcer's voice filled the cab, somber and serious. The new chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, today signaled his intention to combat runaway inflation with a series of aggressive interest rate hikes, warning the American people that there would be difficult economic adjustments ahead. Frank listened, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He looked back at the bank, where Warren and Abernathy were probably signing the papers for another piece of the future. The sky was clear blue, the sun was shining, and the fields were green with promise. But Frank could feel a change in the air. A storm was coming. A different kind of storm, one you couldn't see on the horizon, but one he knew had the power to wash everything away. The first sign of trouble was the sky. The summer of 1980 began with a brassy, cloudless expanse that stretched from one horizon to the other, day after agonizing day. The spring rains had been adequate, and the young corn stood shoulder-high by the 4th of July, its leaves a deep, glossy green. But then the tap turned off. The sun, a merciless white disk, baked the black soil until it cracked open in a spiderweb of fissures. The corn leaves began to curl inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, a gesture that looked like a field of hands clasped in prayer. Frank watched the sky and his fields with a familiar, ancestral anxiety. He cultivated his rows with the old Farmall M, the shovels kicking up clouds of fine grey dust. The work was slow, but it broke the crust on the soil, creating a dust mulch that helped trap what little moisture remained below. It was an old technique, one his father had sworn by during the dry years of the 50s. Warren Bishop, on the other hand, blasted through his fields with a massive field cultivator behind his John Deere 4640, covering 100 acres before lunch. But his heavy machine compacted the soil beneath the surface, and the high-speed passes threw the dry topsoil into the air, where the wind carried it away. Warren was at war with the weather, trying to conquer it with horsepower. Frank was in a careful negotiation with it, trying to endure. One sweltering afternoon in late July, Frank was greasing the fittings on his old New Holland baler when he saw the John Deere dealership's service truck turn into Warren's lane. A few minutes later, a heavy-duty wrecker followed. Frank watched as they loaded Warren's 2-year-old 4640 onto a lowboy trailer. The tractor, the very symbol of modern power and efficiency, looked helpless and broken as it was chained down. Later that week at the co-op, the story was all over the place. "Heard Warren threw a rod right through the side of the block on that 4640, one farmer said, leaning against a pallet of seed bags. Dealer told him it was cheaper to put a whole new engine in it than to try and rebuild that one. Another man whistled low. "What's a new engine for one of those run?" $15,000, and he's got to wait 3 weeks to get it. The number hung in the air, stunning in its scale. $15,000. It was more than Frank's entire farm was worth 20 years ago. It was a debt that would take a good crop, at a good price, just to pay off. And with the drought tightening its grip, a good crop was looking more and more like a fantasy. Frank saw Warren at the parts counter that day. He looked drawn and pale, his usual confident swagger gone. He was arguing with the clerk about the price of a set of hydraulic filters. His voice was tight with stress. He saw Frank, gave a curt, almost hostile nod, and turned away. The cracks were beginning to show. The drought was only the first blow. The second came from Washington. Paul Volcker's war on inflation sent interest rates climbing like a runaway freight train. The prime rate, the number that banks used as a baseline, jumped from 12% to 15%, then to 18%, then to an unthinkable 21%. Operating loans that farmers had signed in the spring at a manageable 9% suddenly had their variable rates adjusted upward. The quarterly interest payments doubled, then tripled. It was a pincer movement, and the farmers of Henderson County were caught in the middle. The weather was strangling their income, while the banks were strangling their cash flow. The easy credit that had fueled the boom years turned into a toxic, unpayable burden. Frank felt it too. The interest rate on his modest savings account crept up, a small but welcome bonus. But the price he got for his drought-stunted corn that fall was depressingly low. He tightened his belt. The family vacation was cancelled. His wife started a bigger garden, canning vegetables to see them through the winter. They patched their clothes instead of buying new ones. They burned wood in the old stove to save on heating oil. They survived because their outgoings were small. They had no heavy machinery payments, no land debt, no massive interest bills coming due. They hunkered down, like a prairie animal in its burrow, waiting for the storm to pass. For Warren Bishop, there was no burrow to hide in. His new engine was paid for with another loan at an even higher interest rate. The farm magazine that had once celebrated him as a visionary now sat yellowing in a pile of old papers. The farmer of the future was trapped in a present he couldn't afford. The phone calls from Mr. Abernathy at the bank, once friendly and encouraging, became clipped and demanding. The letters that arrived in the mail no longer spoke of opportunity, but of obligation, of default, of foreclosure. The empire built on paper equity and ever-increasing debt was beginning to crumble. The winter of 1981 was bleak and bitter, not just because of the cold, but because of the fear that had settled over the countryside. The talk at the diner was no longer about new equipment or record yields. It was about who had received a foreclosure notice, who was selling off their breeding herd, whose land was coming up for auction. The farm crisis had arrived, and it was tearing the heart out of the community. The final, fatal blow came with the grain embargo. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter halted all grain sales to the Soviet Union. The primary customer for America's surplus vanished overnight. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn prices, which had been over $3 a bushel just a few years before, plunged to below $2. At the same time, land values, the very foundation of the farmer's collateral, collapsed. Land that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre was now struggling to fetch $1,000. Farmers who had thought they had 50% equity in their operations suddenly found themselves owing more than their farms were worth. For Warren Bishop, it was the end of the line. His income was cut in half, his interest payments had quadrupled, and his equity was gone. He was technically bankrupt, a millionaire on paper just 2 years prior, now unable to make the next payment. The bank, which had so eagerly lent him the money to expand, now just as eagerly called in the notes. The auction notice appeared in the local paper, a stark, black and white testament to a dream that had died. The date was set for a Saturday in early April. All equipment, tools, and 640 acres of prime farmland to be sold to the highest bidder. Frank saw the notice and felt a profound sadness, not triumph. He saw the human cost behind the cold legal language. He thought of Warren's wife, a kind woman who always brought a cake to the church bake sale. He thought of their children, who rode the same school bus as his own. This wasn't a game where one person won and another lost. It was a tragedy that diminished them all. On the day of the auction, a cold, grey wind whipped across the Bishop farmstead. It was a stark contrast to the sunny, optimistic auction where Frank had bought his Farmall M. There was no popcorn stand, no laughter. The crowd was thin and sombre. Farmers stood in small, quiet groups, their faces etched with worry, their hands shoved deep in their pockets. They were there not just as spectators, but as mourners at a funeral. They knew it could just as easily be their farm, their equipment, their life being sold off piece by piece. The auctioneer, the same Slim Perkins from years before, had none of his usual boisterous energy. His chant was subdued, almost respectful. The magnificent John Deere equipment, once the envy of the county, sold for pennies on the dollar. The 4640, with its nearly new engine, went for less than what Warren had paid for the engine alone. Combines, planters, discs, all were sacrificed at bargain basement prices to investors from the city and a few surviving farmers looking for a deal. Frank watched, his heart heavy. He saw Warren standing near the house, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his face a mask of grey despair. His wife was beside him, her arm linked through his, her eyes red from crying. Frank saw Mr. Abernathy, the banker, standing off to the side, looking uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with the men he had once called his friends. Then the auctioneer moved to the land. They started with the parcels Warren had bought last, the ones with the highest debt against them. They sold cheap, barely enough to cover a fraction of the mortgage. Finally, they came to the last piece. The original home, 80 acres, the land Warren's grandfather had homesteaded, the piece with the house, the barns, the machine shed. "All right, folks," Slim Perkins said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is the home place. 80 acres, house and buildings. A good place to raise a family. Who'll start the bidding for me at $80,000? $1,000 an acre." Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. $80,000 was a fortune to the men standing there, their own finances stretched to the breaking point. 70,000, Slim tried. "Can I get 70? More silence. Frank looked at Warren, who had turned his back, unable to watch. He saw Warren's young son, maybe 10 years old, clinging to his mother's leg, his face buried in her coat. And in that moment, Frank knew what he had to do. It wasn't about being right, it wasn't about vindication, it was about decency. 60,000, Frank said. His voice was steady, cutting through the wind. Every head in the crowd turned to look at him. Slim Perkins' eyes widened in surprise. Mr. Abernathy took a step forward, a flicker of hope on his face. A bid, any bid, was better than none. "I have $60,000 from Frank Miller," Slim announced, his professional rhythm returning. "Do I hear 65? 65,000? A speculator from Peoria, a man in a clean suit who had been buying up distressed farms all morning, raised a finger. 62.5. 65, Frank said immediately, without hesitation. 67.5, the speculator countered, a smirk on his face. Frank took a deep breath. This was the money he had so carefully saved, the money from the good years, the money that represented his security, his freedom. He was about to risk it, not for ambition, but for something more. 75,000, Frank said, his voice ringing with authority. He looked directly at the speculator. The man in the suit held Frank's gaze for a long moment. He saw something in Frank's eyes, not a bluff, but a deep, unyielding resolve. The speculator gave a slight shake of his head and dropped his hand. $75,000 going once, Slim Perkins called out, scanning the crowd. Going twice. Sold. For $75,000 to Frank Miller. A quiet murmur went through the crowd, a sound of disbelief and respect. Frank Miller, the man they had called a fool, had just bought the Bishop home place. Frank walked to the clerk's table. He didn't need to arrange financing. He wrote a check for the 10% down payment from his savings account. The rest would come from the same account when the papers were signed. He was paying cash. After the auction was over and the crowd had dispersed, leaving the farmyard eerily empty, Frank walked over to where Warren and his wife were still standing by the house, looking lost. Warren wouldn't look at him. "Come to gloat, Miller," he said, his voice thick with shame. "Come to see what's left of the farmer of the future." "No, Warren," Frank said quietly. "I came to talk about rent." Warren finally looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. "Rent? I'm not a landlord," Frank said. "I don't want to run this place. You know this ground better than anyone. I want to rent it to you. We'll work out a crop share agreement that's fair. You can stay in the house. You can keep farming." Warren stared at him, speechless. His wife began to cry, but this time they were tears of relief, not despair. "Why?" Warren finally managed to ask, his voice choked. "After all the times I ridiculed you, why would you do this?" Frank looked out over the fields, the same fields he had looked at for a lifetime. He thought of his father's words, about debt being a chain, but he also knew that community was a lifeline. "Because we're neighbors, Warren," Frank said, "and around here, that's supposed to mean something." He held out his hand. After a long moment, Warren took it, his grip firm, a silent acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid with money. Life settled into a new rhythm. The 1980s were lean years for everyone, but the worst of the storm had passed. Frank continued to farm his own land, and Warren, humbled and grateful, farmed the 80 acres Frank now owned. He was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet diligence. He started buying older, smaller equipment at auctions, learning from Frank how to repair and maintain it himself. The two men, once rivals, now often worked together, sharing labor and machinery, helping each other during planting and harvest. The community's perception of Frank had transformed completely. He was no longer the eccentric throwback. He was the wise man, the survivor. Younger farmers, struggling to get started, would stop by his machine shed to ask for advice. They didn't ask about leverage or expansion. They asked about how to rebuild a carburetor, how to set the timing on a magneto, how to get by without going into debt. Frank would wipe the grease from his hands and patiently show them, sharing the knowledge that had been passed down to him. Years passed. The farm economy slowly recovered. Frank's children grew up and moved away to start their own lives, though his youngest son, David, stayed, drawn to the land. Warren eventually saved enough money to buy back his home place from Frank, paying him exactly what Frank had paid for it, with a modest interest rate that was fair to them both. The day they signed the papers, the two men, now older and greyer, shared a handshake that sealed a bond forged in hardship. One crisp autumn afternoon, when Frank was well into his 60s, he was out in the machine shed with his grandson, a boy of 12 named Michael. The boy was watching him work on the old Farmall M. The tractor's red paint was almost completely gone, faded to a soft, rosy orange, but the engine was as sound as ever. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why do you keep this old thing? Uncle David says the new tractors can do 10 times the work." Frank stopped turning his wrench and looked at the boy. He wiped his hands on a red shop rag and patted the tractor's worn iron seat. "This tractor," he began, his voice soft. Teaches you things the new ones can't. It teaches you to listen. You hear that tick in the valve train? That tells you it's time for an adjustment. It teaches you to feel. You feel that vibration through the steering wheel? That tells you a bearing is getting worn. But the most important thing it teaches you is this. He motioned for his grandson to come closer. Your great-grandfather bought this farm with cash after the Depression. I bought this tractor with cash during the good times. We never owed any man for the tools we used or the dirt we stood on. That meant when the hard times came, and they always come, son, one way or another, we were still standing when it was over. This tractor isn't just a machine, it's a promise. It's the promise of being free. He picked up the hand crank. Want to learn how to start her? The boy's eyes lit up. Yeah. Frank showed him how to set the choke and the throttle, how to engage the crank, and how to pull up with his legs, not his back. After a few clumsy attempts, the boy gave a mighty heave. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with its familiar, rhythmic pop, 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 pop. The sound echoed in the machine shed, a sound of resilience, of survival, of a legacy being passed from one generation to the next. Frank looked out the open door of the shed, across the fields that were his, truly his. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple, casting a golden light on the land he had protected. He hadn't gotten rich. He hadn't conquered the world. But he had held on. He had his farm, his family, and his freedom. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was more than enough.